Hello, everyone. My name is Robert SanGeorge, and I'm going to be your presenter today on the subject of how to do best in interviews, in particular, AI interviews, and how to really ace the AI interview, if we can describe it that way. Here's what we're going to be going over today. Why are employers actually using AI at all in interviewing? And what happens when you're a candidate, and how do you feel about it? How does AI interviewing actually work? And how are the various AI systems, and there's one in particular that dominates the market right now, how do they evaluate how you're doing? Then there's something called Big Interview, which is something you can use to practice AI interviews using Handshake. And then we're going to go over, the kinds of questions that are asked, the kind of questions that an AI system would start by asking you. Your own approach to AI interviewing. What should that be? And also, AI interviews are likely to use something called behavioral or performance-based questions. We'll go over that. And also the fairly rigid formula that we strongly recommend for answering those kind of behavioral questions, which is known as a STAR system: situation, task, action, result. And then how to practice interviews using the Big Interview system via AU Handshake. So let's dive right into this. First of all, AI interviewing is not going to go away. Most of you may well realize AI is not going to go away, and neither is the interviewing. From the viewpoint of an employer, these days, they use it for first-round interviews only, for generally entry-level positions or positions that are slightly above entry level. And the purpose is they can screen a lot of candidates without using really much of any of their own staff time. So it cuts an employer's costs, and it accelerates the hiring process. It theoretically eliminates human interview bias. And again, I say that theoretically. There's been some criticisms, candidly, of AI interviewing. The software produces for the employer a standardized automated report that scores you based on a number of criteria. It doesn't really tell an employer, hire this person or don't hire this person, or bring this person on to the next round of interviewing, or don't do that. It lets the employer make that decision, but candidly, it's based on a number of fairly conclusive scores that you would get on various aspects of the interview, and we're going to go over that. This is being increasingly used. I've seen this happening over a 5-year period, roughly, by recruiting firms. It's used a lot in the corporate sector, and even I'm hearing from students more recently that it's being used in the nonprofit sector, mainly among really large employers. So from your standpoint, however, candidly, it's going to seem weird and uncomfortable. You're being interviewed by algorithms, basically. You're staring at a webcam. You're not getting any human feedback at all. And the software is analyzing everything about you, both visual and verbal, every second of the interview. Now, what does that mean? Let's talk about that. First of all, there's one company that I mentioned. I didn't mention their name yet. That's the dominant AI interviewing platform. It's called HireVue. And if you want to go to their website, they do provide some information about what they do. It's at hirevue.com, HIREVUE.com, as you can see on the screen. You are unlikely from employers to get a list of questions in advance. However, when you log into an AI system, whether it's HireVue or another one, you may well get 2 or 3 sort of generic practice questions that help you to warm up before you start the actual interview. You will control the start and the end of every question and answer. You may or may not see a video of a person who's actually asking the question that you have to answer. But when I say that, you control the start time and the end time of your questions, generally the AI system will give you a certain amount of time to answer a question. Let's say it's 60 seconds, for example. When the clock strikes 60, it will cut you off in mid-syllable and go on to the next question, okay? And you will have to start that next question within a certain amount of time. usually a fairly short period of time, maybe 15 seconds after you've finished the previous question. So you, as I say here, you could be cut off in mid-syllable. Now, how are you going to be evaluated by AI? This is the big question that most people don't know much about. You are going to be judged against the profiles of high-performing staff who work in specific jobs for that employer. So in other words, the AI, the company that produces the AI interview for the employer will interview those people and will do research into things like, well, what are the key words or key phrases that someone in this position might be using, and a number of other aspects of the job. But what else is AI going to do in general? Does it require them to interview people who are already in the job that you're applying for? How much you use filler words. I just did one a moment ago, or for example. The more you use it, generally, the lower they score you. Your use of repetitive words. You really got to you've got to try to avoid using words such as like or or really. It's impossible to do, and I don't want you to get too self-confident, conscious about it, but those are words you really want to try to avoid if possible. Facial expressions and facial tics will be evaluated. If you're blinking a lot, the system will assume that denotes that you're nervous, and that will lower your score to some degree. If you don't look at the webcam very much because you're kind of nervous staring at a webcam, that will generally not be good either, although you don't have to stare at the webcam every single moment of the interview, but that should be your default situation. It will also watch your eye movements in terms of whether it denotes nervousness, and also it will look at your posture and body movement. So one of the things you're going to want to do before you start the interview is to make sure you got your back, solidly against the back of the chair you're sitting on, and to sit up straight for the bulk of the interview. And smiling, it will evaluate how much you smile. That's right. You shouldn't be trying to smile all the time. That will be considered, phony, and you might be downgraded by that. But you definitely need to try to smile when it's appropriate in terms of the question that you're answering, and it will evaluate you that way. So, as I mentioned before, the employer will get an automated evaluation report of you based on most, if not all, of these things that I've previously mentioned. Hopefully you can read this on your screen. This is an example from the big interview system that allows you to practice AI interviewing of the ways in which you may be evaluated. For example, how fast are you talking? Is it too fast because you're nervous? Is it too slow because you're having trouble answering the questions? Or is it kind of right in the middle? In other words, the Goldilocks principle, not too much, not too little, just right. How much will you use the word or ah, or other filler words, okay? And what about your vocabulary? Not necessarily jargon that pertains to the job, but in general, how articulate are you in terms of using multisyllabic words from time to time? And it will evaluate you on that basis. Then we've got filler words, aside from the issue of words such as like and really and things like that. Then there's power words. That would have a lot to do with knowing a little bit about the jargon that's used in a job. And then it will evaluate your pauses. Pausing occasionally is okay, but long or repetitive pauses, as it says here, can make you sound confused or even raise red flags. So those are, in general, the ways in which an AI system will evaluate you when you're answering questions. Now, let's talk about hard and soft skills and competencies for a job and what that means in terms of how you should be answering questions. These kinds of evaluation of hard and soft skills is going to vary greatly depending upon a job. So you need to be doing some research on the job you've applied for. And by the way, if I haven't mentioned it previously, generally speaking, employers these days are not using AI systems to interview people for internships, only for jobs, okay? We may come to a time when they start using AI to interview people for internships, but that hasn't happened yet. what are some of the skills that we need to be talking about? Written and oral communication skills, important for virtually any kind of job you would apply for. How conscientious are you? They're not going to ask you, are you conscientious? But they're going to try to evaluate that based on your answers to a bunch of other questions. How good is your problem solving? And usually that means how good are your research and analytical skills in terms of your approach to a job? How good of a team player are you? Generally speaking, there are certain research jobs that might be highly independent, research assistant type positions. But generally speaking, employers are looking for people who are collaborative. Collaboration, collaborative, those are kind of the buzzwords in many ways of the 21st century for a lot of employers. And how good are you at sort of getting yourself going as a self-starter, which is a term you've probably heard too often, versus, for example, hard skills, which often play out as specific software skills, specific foreign language skills. Do you have specific relevant experience from an internship or a job in the field in which you were applying for the job? What about your quantitative skills, if that's relevant to the job you're applying for? And candidly, that's becoming more and more important for just about any job. Do you have any coding skills? What about data analytics, which is part of, that's tied up with quantitative skills? Do you have any data analytics skills, even on a fundamental basis? Okay. Other sorts of things. Have you had experience with strategic planning? What about anything involving project management or budget management or budget planning? If you are in a STEM field, what kind of STEM specific skills do you have? If you are trying to get a job that involves chemistry, well, what kind of skills do you have from hopefully having been a chemistry major or having working on a graduate degree in chemistry, just as an example, okay? Now, what will the AI systems do in terms of starter questions, okay? Many of you probably had the experience of saying, so Jim, so Jane, tell us about yourself. And that's what the AI system might do too. They might also, in a way, blindside you by saying, what do you know about our company or our organization? You need to be ready for that question, because you do not want to be a deer in the headlights with only being able to say something highly generic about what an employer does. That doesn't mean you have to go into 90 seconds of detail about what they do, but you want to have a pretty good coherent statement ready to go as to what that particular employer does. Why do you want to work for us? Again, a question you can anticipate and you need to be ready for. What do you hope to be doing career-wise when you graduate, or in 2 years, or in 3 years, or in 5 years? The answers to those questions are a little bit different, but you need to be ready for something like that. And what are the best strengths? What are your most important strengths for this position? Again, there should be at least 2 strengths that you can cite immediately without hesitation as to why you would be a good fit for a particular job. And then there's what I call the dreaded weakness question. What would be your most important challenge or your most important weakness entering this job? You do not want to handle that on the fly. You want to have an answer to that ready to go that basically walks that fine line between not something that's too major and disqualifies you for the job, and not something that's so lame that it is something the employer would reject. One of the things I warn people not to use, because I know it's used a lot, is, well, I believe my most important weakness is that I'm such a perfectionist that sometimes I lose the forest for the trees. That is a lame answer. That is not going to work, and you need to think of something else in terms of answering that question about what would be your most significant weakness going into a particular position. Now, some basics with regard to getting ready for the AI interview. You need to be upbeat and energetic every moment. And by the way, that applies to regular old interviews with human beings over Zoom or Microsoft Teams or in person. You need to be upbeat and energetic every moment of an interview, because who would hire someone who is not upbeat and energetic? Okay? For the AI interview, and really for just about any interview, don't assume that an employer has a casual dress work environment. wear business clothes, okay? Make sure the room that you're in, because you're going to be doing this on a screen with an AI system, is well illuminated. Make sure that you're not hunched over and looking down at the webcam because your desk isn't very high, and then you're using a laptop which does not raise it much higher than that. So my strong advice is place books or a box under your computer so that the webcam is roughly level with your eyes, which is kind of what I'm doing right now. My webcam is actually a little bit higher than my eye level, but you don't want to be looking down, hunched over, looking down. It's not a good look. Drink some water beforehand. Have a glass of water ready nearby so that you don't, start straining your throat. Make good eye contact with the webcam. I've already talked about that. Don't need to say that anymore. Avoid distracting hand gestures. Keep your hands down and not in front of your face. Smile when it's appropriate. And let me give you a tip about, remember those questions that we dealt with in the previous slide? Why do you want to work for us? Where do you hope to be in 3 years? That sort of thing. I often suggest that you put yellow sticky notes, either digital ones if you have software that actually does yellow sticky notes on your computer, or actual physical yellow sticky notes around the screen, the Zoom or Microsoft Teams screen that you're using for doing the AI interview. And the way to deal with that is you're not writing out full answers, because then you're going to be leaning in and trying to read what you said in rather small print, small handwriting. What you want is what I call a memory jolt, a talking point that is only 3 or 4 words long. So for example, a question such as, at the top you put 3 years, question mark, meaning what do you hope to be doing in 3 years? And 1 3-word, 4-word memory jolt that's going to remind you, because in the middle of an interview, you can forget what it was you had prepared to say. It's going to remind you of what your answer is to that question. I would suggest using as many as 6 or 8 of these around the Zoom screen. And by the way, the Zoom screen or the Microsoft Teams screen that you're using should be all the way up on your screen to the top of the screen and centered right at where the webcam is. Okay? That's the way to ensure that you're going to be keeping the best posture and having the best look at the webcam. So I mentioned that earlier in the presentation, that a lot of times AI systems will ask you behavioral questions. Don't pay too much attention to that word behavioral. It's something that psychologists thought up. What these kind of questions really are questions about the kinds of skills you've developed that are relevant to this particular job that you're applying for. So here are some examples, just 4 examples. Tell us about a time when you used your best interpersonal skills, or your best communication skills, or your best leadership skills. The question won't be listed with those multiple choices. I'm explaining to you how the best interpersonal skills, best communication skills, etc., to solve a problem or achieve a goal. When did you use your best interpersonal skills to do that? Please describe a time when you may have encountered hostility in a workplace or academic setting, and how did you deal with it? This may not necessarily deal with hostility you encountered directed at you, but perhaps 2 other people in kind of an open office who were not getting along with each other, and the unpleasantness was spilling over to you, and you were having trouble concentrating with your work. How did you deal with that? Please tell us about a time when you were working in a team setting and one of your teammates was failing to live up to their responsibilities. I have never advised a student, and I've advised probably well over 1,000, who have not had this experience working on a team in a course. So how did you work with other members of the team to resolve a situation in which one of the team members was failing to live up to their responsibilities? The key thing here, if you're asked this question, is that you don't throw people under the bus. And what I mean by that is, let's say you were in a class and you were on a team with 4 other people, and the 3 of you who were living up to your responsibilities ended up having to do the work of 4 people. What you're not going to say things about how you looked into what the trouble was with that person and what they were going through. Employers don't want to know about that kind of gossip. All you should say is perhaps the person was having some kind of an emotional difficulty or family difficulty. We don't know, but we had to get on with the work. That's all you do for a question like that. Another interesting behavioral question. Please describe a time when you were in the middle of a project and through no fault of your own, the objectives changed for some reason. Your supervisor informed you. How did you respond to that? What they want to know is that you're adaptable, that you're not someone who sits around and thinks, woe is me, but that you're adaptable and you can get on with the work, okay? Those are the kinds of questions you're likely to be asked in terms of behavioral questions that are different than the conventional questions, which I mentioned before. You know, what is your most significant weakness for this job? What's your most significant strength? Those kinds of conventional questions. Now, with regard to these behavioral questions, strongly recommend, as strongly as I possibly can, that you use what's known as the STAR system for answering them. So you start out by talking about either the situation you found yourself in, for example, sitting in an office and two people are hostile to each other and it's an unpleasant atmosphere. That's not something you were assigned to do. That was a situation. Most of the time, behavioral questions, however, are not going to deal with a situation. They're going to deal with a task that you were assigned. In other words, an assignment. And then what action or actions you took, you must answer that, if at all possible, in a strict chronological order. Why? Because the people who are listening to this are, and I'm not talking about an AI system now, but just any kind of interview. The people who are listening to this are only going to hear this story about this task or situation once, and they're never going to hear it again. And if you begin jumping around in a timeline, they're going to lose you. Strict adherence to a chronological timeline and explaining what you did, and then the result or results of your actions stated very concisely. Okay, that's what you have to do when answering behavioral questions. You can practice AI interviewing, by the way, using Big Interview. So these are the steps. You go to Handshake and you click on a left side navigation tab. You're logged into Handshake and you're on the main page and you click on a left side navigation tab called Resources. You click on that and then you're going to see in the Resources menu something called Big Interview. You click on that. Big Interview is actually not Handshake. It's meant to work with Handshake. So you have to register at no cost to yourself in the Handshake system. And then what you will want to do with Big Interview, because you can practice interviews on Big Interview without using an AI feature. But in the case of knowing that you've got an AI interview coming up, there is going to be try the new AI feedback feature, and it will give you several options of the kinds of questions you can have yourself confronted by. General questions, in other words, the kinds of conventional ones I mentioned before. Industry-specific questions, depending upon what kind of employer it is, and also government-specific questions. That does not mean the federal government per se, which quite candidly is not hiring a lot these days, but we could be talking about state and municipal government agencies, as well as government contractors, because the interviews for contractors can be fairly similar to a government agency itself. And you should also be selecting among the various options for behavioral questions, and assuming that you're applying for an entry-level job, entry-level practice. If you're applying for a job that's a bit above that, then you'll have to select what other options are possible. So again, you go to Resources, you click on Resources in the navigation, the main page navigation on Handshake. Then you click on Big Interview, you register for Big Interview, and then you use the Big Interview menu to get yourself to a point where you're going to be asked a bunch of questions in a way that is similar to what would happen with, for example, a HireVue interview. And by the way, you will then get feedback. Once you're done, you will get feedback from the Big Interview AI system that is fairly similar to what an employer would see when you're doing an AI interview. Okay. Finally, research your prospective employer. It's really important no matter what kind of interview you're doing. One way you can do that, by the way, is to go to glassdoor.com and look for specific information about interviewing that employer does. Generally speaking, you will only find information about the kinds of interviews an employer does if it's a medium-sized or larger employer, okay? But give it a shot. Check out hireview.com because they will give examples, including, I believe, even videos of what an AI interview, part of an AI interview might look like. And when you're using Big Interview within the AU's handshake system, you want to use this for virtual interviewing, for AI interviews, because all AI interviews are going to be virtual. Also, entry-level job interviewing that isn't necessarily AI interviewing, and interviewing for specific types of employers, which may or may not be AI interviews, okay? So, that's all something that is quite doable for you in terms of what we are able to provide in terms of preparation. Also, know that depending on what AU school you're in, you have access to career advisors, virtually all of whom know a fair amount, not necessarily experts, but they know a fair amount about AI interviewing. And they also know a lot about regular job interviewing and internship interviewing, and they can be quite helpful to you. One thing you should not do is ask a career advisor to do a mock AI interview with you, because as I think you can tell, that defeats the purpose. You're talking to a human being and not an AI system. If you want to practice AI interviewing, you do that with the Big Interview system so that's what you're looking at. That is the end of the presentation. I hope it's been useful. And, if you've got additional questions about this, go to, the Kogod Career Center. The Kogod School has its own career center. School of International Service has their own career center. And then all the other AI schools, not the law school, all the other AI schools are dealt with in the main AU Career Center with specific advisors who mainly focus on specific skills. So it's been a pleasure giving this presentation to you, and I hope it's been useful, and good day.